Next, we would like to invite up Frances Bernstein, Head of Harmony Choir, Leeds.
Hello, it's wonderful to have been invited to talk to you today. As well as being head of Harmony Choir Leeds, I think Isa felt that I could tell you a little story that might be inspiring. People, when their rights are denied, might find it very hard to keep going and keep fighting for their rights. So I think that's why I'm here, is to give you a little bit of inspiration. It's a personal story. I was born and spent my childhood in South Africa. It was a happy childhood, but it had a dark side because I was born in the era of apartheid, the strictest ever system of laws based on skin colour that has existed anywhere in the world, where everyone was classified at birth according to the colour of their skin, and that determined every aspect of their life, where they could live, where they could work, who they could marry, which school they could go to, which bus they could ride on, which park bench they could sit on. So I was part of that privileged white minority of South Africa, who ruled South Africa, and that was I was fortunate in that way, just to have been born with the right colour skin. I was also fortunate to have parents who hated the system of apartheid and believed in the innate equality of all human beings. And they joined with others to work for change. So they initially joined the Communist Party. It was the only party that didn't have a racial segregation, so whites and blacks could join it. And then later they also worked with the young leaders who were growing up in the 1950s of the African Liberation Movement and the African National Congress. And that is where they met. I'm getting to the point of my little story. That is where they met Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and other young leaders of the African Liberation Movement. And my dad described these men as men of exceptional ability and total dedication to their ideal without regard to self. And he felt he was the luckiest person to have met them and to join with them in organising campaigns. In the 1950s and early 1960s, they had a campaign called the Defiance Campaign, where black people would go into places they were prohibited, get onto trains that were for white people only, get onto buses that were for white people only, and defy the apartheid laws. They also had a campaign to encourage people all over the country to put forward their ideas for what kind of society they wanted. And they called a lot of people together and drew up a thing called the Freedom Charter in 1956. And it was the people's expression of their ideas for freedom and equality. And my father, who was a good writer and used to write a lot of propaganda material, became one of the authors of the Freedom Charter. And it established basic principles. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. All national groups shall have equal rights. The land will be shared among those who work it. All people shall have equal rights to use their own languages. So very basic issues of human rights, but it was illegal to be campaigning for those basic human rights, and any campaigning had to be carried on underground and at risk of imprisonment, arrest and imprisonment. So I knew my father was involved in stuff. He used to go out at night. One night he went out and he didn't come back. And the next day I found out the reason, which was that along with a group of other leaders of the movement, he had been arrested. And he was put on trial alongside Mandela and several other of the leading figures. And I think you might know the outcome of the trial for Mandela, which was and for all the others, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. And my father, by good fortune, was acquitted, and we were able to escape to England, where I have lived happily ever since. Meanwhile, while I've grown up, Mandela and the others languished in prison, but a new generation of activists grew up to carry on the struggle for freedom. So I'll just mention that as a child, I only knew of 2 languages in South Africa. That was English, which I spoke at home, Afrikaans, which was taught at school, and it was the language of the white government, the Dutch colonizers who had colonized South Africa, and we learned it at school. And I was unaware that I lived in a country that was rich in indigenous languages. So while Mandela was in prison, the new wave of rebellion was sparked off by students in Soweto who began to protest because Afrikaans was being imposed on them in schools as the language of instruction. And they went out on the streets and protested and were shot down, but sparked off a whole new wave of resistance to the apartheid system, joined by young people, trade unionists, women, and then international solidarity and the boycott movement. And I think we know the ending to the story because it's an unbelievably inspiring story of Mandela, and it's well known across the world that after 26 years in prison on Robben Island with great hardships and deprivation, he emerged to negotiate with the white government their own end and an end to apartheid. And 30 years after I left South Africa, I went back to take part in the first free elections in which every person, regardless of skin colour, had the right to vote. And that was a joyous occasion. And it ushered in a constitution based on full equality and human rights. And a lot of it reflects those principles of the Freedom Charter of the 1950s. And it's one of the best constitutions in the world. It's hailed by many as an example for other countries, as a model for law and constitutional experts, because it establishes a society based on democratic values, social justice and fundamental human rights. I'll just mention, because it's the Mother Tongue International Day, the aspect of language, because part of the Constitution is that all people shall have equal rights to their own language, and the state has to take practical and positive measures to elevate the status of the indigenous languages of the people. It gave the right of every cultural, religious or linguistic community to enjoy their culture, practice their religion and use their language, and that all official languages, of which there were 11 up till last year, they added sign language, so there are 12 official languages in South Africa, and they must all enjoy parity of esteem and be treated equitably. So I think the reason I'm here in the lesson of the story is that no matter how long human rights may be denied, they can't be denied forever. People will always triumph in the end, and Mandela became a beacon to people across the world to not give up on their struggles for basic human rights. Through all kinds of hardships, justice can be won.